Great, thanks. Yeah, so my name is Regan Moss, and I am presenting on behalf of Auburn students against human trafficking. So we'll go ahead and get started. Pull up the presentation. Great. Okay, so like I said, I'm presenting on behalf of Auburn students against human trafficking. We are a relatively new organization, and our mission is to engage students in the movement to eradicate human trafficking. So today I'm going to start by doing that by debunking a bunch of common myths and misconceptions about human trafficking. And I'm just going to be presenting a lot of more general information in hopes that people can better understand a lot of the information that might otherwise be in academic journals or in other means that are typically pretty hard to digest. Also, as I'm presenting today, I'm going to be using the word victim. I'm not using this word to victimize or to blame people or to belittle the people that have been trafficked. I'm using this word to help to hopefully build some context about the experiences in which these people have been exploited and to help everyone understand how coercive human trafficking is. So the first myth that we're going to debunk is the idea that human trafficking only happens in foreign countries or that only foreigners are trafficked. It makes sense how this myth began and how it's circulated. We all know, or a lot of us know, that trafficking exists. However, it's pretty difficult to identify, and it's a crime that's not in the open. So it's easy to understand that it exists and not see it, and then immediately throw it to another country or to people that we don't know. However, most trafficking actually happens domestically. So while foreigners are trafficked, citizens are trafficked too. So most of the people that are trafficked within the United States are actually from the United States. And most of the people in the United States that will be trafficked will stay within the United States. Which brings me to the next myth. A lot of people believe that human trafficking involves moving a person across state and national borders. So while people might move while they're trafficked, most people are actually trafficked locally. It happens really discreetly. And like I mentioned, it's hard to identify. But for example, if someone grew up in Birmingham, it's likely that they will be trafficked in Birmingham versus Atlanta. And it's most likely that that person will stay relatively within the same area as they're being exploited. Some reports estimate that millions of people were trafficked within the United States, while only a few thousand were trafficked into. So while we want to acknowledge those thousands of people that were trafficked within the United States, we also want to acknowledge that those are the minority of cases. So the next myth that a lot of people might believe is that labor trafficking is only a primary issue in developing countries. Labor trafficking actually happens in both developing countries as well as developed countries, but it might be difficult to identify because it could look different in China as compared to South Africa, the United States, or Italy. So a lot of times there could be variance in labor trafficking in terms of the means or the methods or even the purpose for which someone is exploited. And this could be for a variety of reasons. So for example, there could be regional differences, different geographic demands, different structural conditions, and also the victims might have different demographics. The next myth is a pretty big one, and that it is that human trafficking is hidden. I'm sure a lot of you have been to the Atlanta airport and seen signs and pictures all along the walls of people that are in chains or in cages. There's also a lot of ideas that people that are trafficked might be stuffed beneath floorboards or hidden in cages, as I mentioned, or in mattress frames. But actually, trafficking is described as being hidden in plain sight. Trafficking happens out in the open. but it's really difficult to identify because it is very manipulative and nuanced. Traffickers use means of force, fraud, and coercion in order to manipulate the person that they are victimizing. So for example, a lot of traffickers might threaten to kill family members of the victim. They could confiscate documents such as IDs or passports and even social security information. They also commonly physically or sexually assault victims. And really importantly, they can force the victim into committing illegal acts themselves. So for example, traffickers might commonly have a victim commit violence against someone else that is being exploited. They might force them to use illicit substances, or in cases of labor trafficking and domestic servitude, they might force them to work with hazardous or prohibited equipment. Traffickers do this because it builds a sense of power and fear from the trafficker, and it also creates animosity amongst the other victims. All right, so the next myth that we're going to debunk is the idea that trafficking only happens to girls. This is one I'm really, really passionate about. So girls, boys, men, and women are all trafficked, and they're trafficked for both sex as well as labor. There are gender-based differences in terms of the variance in demand or the form of trafficking, as well as like the means by which people are trafficked, or the prevalence of sex trafficking for girls in different regions. But in order to acknowledge these differences and really flesh out the process of trafficking in order to eradicate it, we first have to understand and acknowledge that boys are trafficked and men are trafficked and women are trafficked too. Also, kind of tangenting off of this, a lot of people believe that only men can be pimps or traffickers. And while a lot of men or a lot of traffickers are men, women can also be traffickers, and women can also be beneficiaries of both sex trafficking as well as labor trafficking. All right, so the next myth is that trafficking usually involves kidnapping, or that traffickers target people that they don't know. Numerous reports have shown that kidnapping is actually the least common recruitment tactic. So while kidnapping does happen, it's in very rare circumstances. The most common way by which someone is recruited into the trafficking industry is through a romantic partner or someone they know. It's also really common for people to be trafficked by a family member or a friend or a peer. And even before the likelihood that someone is kidnapped, they're more likely to be trafficked online or through fake work ads than they are to be kidnapped by someone they don't know. So another common misconception is the idea that the only form of trafficking is sex trafficking. So I kind of alluded to it earlier, but there are actually numerous forms of commercial exploitation. So people can be trafficked for labor purposes, as well as for sex and sexual services and domestic servitude. So to give you some examples, people could be trafficked into the restaurant industry, the commercial fishing industry. They might work in shopping malls, on farms, or at theaters. Just within sex trafficking alone, 25 different types of exploitation have been identified. And notably, these forms of trafficking have only been named based off of the few victims that have been identified. There are likely numerous other forms of exploitation that we have yet to know about because the people that have been exploited to these sectors have yet to be identified. All right, so the next myth is pretty similar to the last one I talked about with sex trafficking. There's often a common misconception that prostitution is not the same as trafficking. However, a lot of anti-trafficking advocates would say that prostitution is a form of trafficking. So I put this line on the slide, and I want to explain it because it might be a little confusing. A lot of anti-trafficking advocates are pro-sex workers, but anti-sex work. And what I mean by this is that we support the people that have been victimized and exploited while acknowledging that sex work really gives the illusion that there is an agency of choice. So a lot of the people that are trafficked come from similar backgrounds and that they have had adverse experiences and they face unjust conditions and other inequities. So there is this illusion of choice driven by inequities. And even though people might join or partake in prostitution or be trafficked for different reasons, there is still a lot of coercion and manipulation and common life experiences. Right, so the final myth that I want to debunk is the idea that victims will be grateful for help or that they will want to leave their trafficker. So as I mentioned earlier, traffickers can force victims to commit illegal acts. So I mentioned some of them. They could force them to assault other victims, to use drugs and the like. And they're very manipulative and over time lead the victim to believe that they are the offender. So a lot of victims don't necessarily identify as being a victim of crime. And if they do want to escape their exploitative situation, it might be difficult to do so since they have committed illegal acts through manipulation. In addition, as I mentioned, a lot of people are trafficked through a romantic partner, and it's a process called boyfriending. So although the victim might disclose that they have been abused, they develop a trauma bond. So the victim may also wish to receive comfort from the person who abused them through this cycle of abuse. I've talked about it pretty much in every slide, but trafficking is very manipulative, and there are repeated, extreme, and prolonged forms of violence over time. So the person that is being exploited might try and rationalize or defend the abusive actions of their trafficker because they feel a sense of loyalty and isolation from others. All right. So as I mentioned, we're a relatively new organization, Auburn Students Against Human Trafficking, and I would love for anyone that wants to take part in any capacity to get involved. So you don't have to know anything about trafficking in order to participate in our club. Our first goal is to make sure that anyone that joins feels comfortable and understanding these myths, but also having deeper critical conversations about the entirety of the process of trafficking pre, peri, and post someone's exploitative experiences. We also have an Instagram and Facebook. So if you have any more questions or you want to reach out and be involved in other events, you can connect with us this way, or you can also email us. And then finally, January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And with the Honors College, we are hosting a few different drives. So Blanket Fort Hope, as well as Hope Haven, are both trafficking shelters within Alabama that seek to help victim survivors. So Blanket Fort Hope is currently trying to build a crisis home and a therapy center. So if you're interested in helping, they are collecting monetary donations. So you can either send the money on PayPal, or you can mail checks, and I put their address on this flyer. And then Hope Haven is gathering a variety of different supplies, which you can place in bins at Cater Hall. So they're collecting art supplies, laundry detergent, paper goods. You can see a few different items. So if you have time and would like to, you can go pick those up and drop them off throughout the entire month of January, and then we will disseminate them at Hope Haven.
All right, thank you so much, Regan, for that. And so I'm still leaving some room and some time for everyone to put some questions in, either through the chat or through anonymously through that onlinequestions.org using the event code. Let me copy and paste that one more time for the people who might have missed it earlier. One question that I have found is, with trafficking, is there such thing as there being consent? And if it's consented, is it still considered trafficking?
Right. Yeah. So in order for something to be considered trafficking, it happens like the TVPA definition, which is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It has to happen by means of force, fraud, and coercion. And there are many different ways that can happen. I mentioned some, like threats to a family member, but also it can be really difficult to notice these means because it's very manipulative, and a lot of it is psychological or emotionally abusive. So there's a lot of like gaslighting, a lot of grooming, and slowly over time, and that's part of why this trauma bond forms. So anti-trafficking advocates would say that no, there is no consent involved in trafficking. Sometimes there's that illusion of choice originally, where people might be basically told, go, make money on the street, or else you're not going to get food, right? So it might not be their pimp, but there's still this illusion that they can have a choice when really either choice is unjust. If at any point in time someone was consenting to a situation, it wouldn't be described as human trafficking. To like answer your question like forwardly, however, there's just a lot of nuance, and a lot of these things have to be studied in a really contextual basis.
Awesome. Okay, another question I see are, sorry, I just lost it. But do you know of any sort of legal protections or laws surrounding human trafficking, and what are some things that we could know that are already in place for those who fall victim to this?
Yeah. So there are some laws that circulate around trafficking, but since it's so hidden, it's kind of hard to target. One of the laws that Courtney and I advocate for, who is also an Auburn Students Against Human Trafficking, is making it illegal to buy sex work, because then that takes away the demand. So not making it illegal for the people that are sex workers, but making it illegal to buy the services. Also, a lot of people that are trafficked have similar adverse experiences or face inequities, such as like housing instability or homelessness, or they might come from situations of domestic abuse. A lot of people that are trafficked are runaways, or they are gay children, or they might be of like a minority status. And so if we can advocate for policies that also support those people and help to chip away at those inequities, even though that's not directly targeting human trafficking, it tends to target a lot of the drivers of exploitation.
Gotcha. I see one online. Are there cases of men being trafficking, and why would you think that's not necessarily, and I guess for me to add on to that question is, why do you think there is not necessarily as much conversation about that particular part of it?
Yes. So to answer the first question, there are for sure men that are trafficked. That's actually like my area of research that I study, is men being trafficked or people that are transgender. So a few things to say off of that. Men might be trafficked for different reasons. So it depends, like for example, in the South, girls are more commonly trafficked for sexual purposes. However, in other countries, men might be more likely to be exploited for sex. One of the first trafficking victims that I heard from, I was attending some conference and he spoke. He was trafficked for sex when he was 12 years old. So men are definitely trafficked for sex and for labor, and girls are also trafficked for labor. And we're still, I guess, like researchers really trying to tease out exactly, how that happens, because there are gender-based differences. And to answer the second part of your question, why it's not talked about, just thinking about like movies or, in the Atlanta airport, a lot of the depictions are of girls and of women. And so it's easy to kind of get that idea circulating. And also, a lot of the like isms that drive exploitation, such as like sexism or racism, try and like silence the ideas, you know, that men could be trafficked for sex. And also a lot of men might feel less comfortable vocalizing their experiences because of other drivers, like toxic masculinity and sexism again.
Okay, gotcha. You just alluded to it a little bit, but could you tell us more about your research experience with it? What really got you into this once again, who you've worked with on campus, and what has that kind of like led you to?
Yes. So I originally became interested in trafficking like right at the end of high school, but I was more so interested in labor trafficking. Basically, I just got into a lot of documentaries about like fast fashion, and that kind of sent me down that spiral. But then when I came to Auburn, I got involved with a lab first semester of my freshman year called Restore. And Restore is a really, really great research lab because it's community-based. So we have people that are victims and survivors on our team. And so they can highlight their lived experiences while we can provide like resources and access also to like healthcare providers and other advocates in different sectors. So as I mentioned earlier, most of the research that like I have posed and that I'm really involved in is highlighting gender-based differences. A lot of literature really only talks about girls being trafficked. And it's not necessarily that researchers only think that girls are trafficked. It's that usually girls are more, once again, like vocal or more easily identified. And so it's really hard to get participants that are men or, you know, that might be of like a religious minority and different sorts like that. And so, yeah, a lot of the research that I'm involved in is specifically targeting male victims and transgender victims and highlighting their experiences so that we can also start to flesh out the differences between girls and men, which ultimately would help to better understand like how trafficking happens in the first place. Some of the other work, as I mentioned, we have like healthcare providers on the team and survivors on the team. So another project is working to disseminate this information to healthcare providers and helping people to implement our findings like into their practice, and also helping them to, you know, sort of bridge the gap and be able to connect with survivors themselves.
Gotcha. Any lingering questions? Go ahead and put them down in the chat. One question that I've come across is, once again, describing the difference between human trafficking and migrant smuggling. Is it just the exploitation piece? Well, I guess both have exploitation pieces to them, but how would you define those differences then?
Yeah, so part of it is the like force, fraud, and coercion that is associated with trafficking. A lot of times with smuggling, there's a little, arguably there is some consent. In some cases, there is not consent, but there's usually kind of a transaction where people are paid to be smuggled across a border. People that are smuggled can end up being trafficked and vice versa. But the key distinction is that it's really a transaction and there's not so much of the force and coercion aspects.
Gotcha. Let me check through one more time. On a personal note, do you plan, is this like part of this research that you've done, is this what you plan to like kind of go into a lifelong commitment to it, or like work towards fighting that in particular, or?
A little bit. Human trafficking is a research interest of mine. I'm just like in a general sense interested in adversity and marginalization. But I'm more so interested in like the neurochemical impact of that. That way I can work like on an intervention standpoint. So I'd like to be like plugged into teams like this, but kind of more on the medical side of it.
Gotcha. All right. Last question for you. Which is, therefore, how does one recognize that something may be wrong? They see a friend or a family member that something feels off, what are the signs kind of there, and how can we kind of reach in and have those conversations?
Yeah, so a few things off of that. Usually when people have like a gut instinct that like something about a situation just doesn't really add up, it seems kind of off, usually they're pretty right. So for example, sometimes in like healthcare settings, someone might go in to see a doctor and they might have a person with them that like won't let them speak for themselves, usually like being their trafficker. And so like that would be a red flag. The person doesn't have, isn't able to like take initiative and speak for themselves. Also, if people act really, really isolated, or they kind of seem like emotionally a little dysregulated, that can be a red flag as well. It's a lot of the same, they're distinctly different, but a lot of similarities with people that have been abused in like a domestic situation, or people that are in unhealthy relationships. And importantly, I think a lot of us, when we see bad situations, we want to like intervene and like try and jump in. But with trafficking, in order to not make things worse or like aggravate the trafficker, it's best to report it. There's like trafficking tip lines, or, you know, notifying another person that has like authority. That way, you know, the trafficker doesn't like leave town with the person or threaten to kill the person, things like that, that could make the situation even worse.
Gotcha. Well, folks, are there any more questions, concerns, ideas, thoughts? Did anything stand out to you? Everyone's pretty quiet today, but thank you so much. Of course, thank you for being here. So before we wrap this up, once again, just a reminder that the Honors College is hosting donation drives. There are bins located inside of Cater Hall on campus. Check out our social medias to learn more about what type of donations, where they're going, what do we need, and how you can help with this cause. I'm also in the chat about to release a link to a survey about today's event. As always, we are looking for fun, engaging topics to bring and discuss, events to bring. So if you have any questions, concerns, suggestions for future events at the Honors College, please let us know. Take a moment to fill out that survey. Regan, how can they get in contact with you?
Yeah, I will leave 2 emails in the chat. So you can either reach out to me through my Auburn email, or if you want to reach out to like our general organization, we have a Gmail for that. Yeah, so people are more than welcome to email if you have any questions, or if you want to get involved. We have a Google form that's like in the link of our like Gmail signature, where you can just drop your name and your email and let us know that you want to get plugged into other activities and events.